here at AEF 2022, and I have you, Dan Kammen. You're a big name, I have to say, right?
Please.
No, listen, I have to say that because and our story goes a long way, and I have to thank you for that, because when I was writing my book, The Wind Energy Outlook in Africa, so I reached out to you. So obviously you couldn't because you were too busy to do it, but at least you considered that. And at the time, like I said, I was still sort of emerging, right? So I really appreciated that as well, even the advice at that time. And I wanted to do something slightly different with you, right?
Okay.
And the question is, okay, we just talked about that. You're going to many conferences, right? Yeah.
Unfortunately.
Fortunately, yeah. About Africa, but also beyond. But that's true. But let's talk about Africa today because it's African Energy Forum. So, do we really need those conferences? Why are they necessary?
Well, I don't know if we need conferences, but it's pretty clear to me what we do need is the vehicles for shared learning, because the experience at utilities around the world is incredibly varied. Some are well on the way to unbundling and ending their kind of vertical integration and having a much bigger opportunity for renewables to come online, whether it's their own investments, whether it is merchant plants, PPPs, a variety of structures. But the more, at least I see the utility experience, and by utility experience I mean not just the big traditional investor-owned utilities.
Yeah.
I mean municipal utilities, I mean local mini-grids that might be small as a health clinic or as big as the city of Goma in DRC, that those experiences are varied, but there's a common thread that requires group learning. And the common thread for me is whether you liked or didn't like your utility in the past, it was almost certainly a base load power unidirectional flow where they sent energy to their clients and their clients sent money and sometimes complaints, but mainly money to them. That world is over. There are certainly traditionally structured utilities, but they're increasingly dealing with difficult challenges. How to blend the investments they've made either a long time ago or very recently in fossil fuels with new investments in renewables, and how do they do the mix of projects so that they can utilize and give a good return on their existing thermal projects or large hydro, but increasingly be a player in clean energy. That requires something that not all utilities have the capacity for. Not all utilities have their own modeling teams. And so the more that we have conferences or meetings that bring these stories together, the more we can actually accelerate that group learning. And I think that's a critical part of the story. And I haven't even gotten to what's going to happen with floating solar and electric vehicles and use of hydrogen. There are all these challenges coming that will require, I think, what these conferences at their best supply. And that's a chance to learn across the platforms.
Okay.
Dan.
Okay, Daniel, we are back after a small interruption.
Small day interruption.
Exactly. So, no, I think yesterday we talked about whether or not those conferences are needed or not. And you say that to some extent we need to obviously see each other.
And we need to share best practices,
Exactly.
working business models, technical stories around energy storage, where we are in energy access. So I don't know whether we physically need conferences, but we need to share. And if we lost some of that during COVID, conferences aren't the worst way to get it back.
Yeah, and I think there's also this there's a human element where we actually can physically meet, connect, bond together, and then I guess obviously get something done. Okay, that's great. So the question then coming out of this, so you've been attending at many conferences.
Too many.
Do you see anything actually changing?
Well, so there's a long answer to that. Okay. I mean, I would say the short answer is yes. I do see things changing, but mainly the promise of the Paris Climate Accords was that this $100 billion a year fund would be available for developing countries, and that would be the ongoing commitment. And Paris was now 7 years ago.
Yeah.
And only this past year at COP26 did the world collectively tick over 100 billion in commitments for the year we're in right now. Now, a lot of Western governments sort of championed the fact that we got to the $100 billion point. Developing nations are saying, but this was an annual commitment.
Yep.
And no one is saying that there's another 100 billion this year, another 100 billion next year. And we all know that even if we did that, 100 billion a year for industrializing countries is only a down payment on what needs to be spent overall. Nigeria needs at least 10 billion a year. South Africa needs at least 10 billion a year as ongoing flows of external capital to convince conservative ministers to show that we're really addressing the just transition and the jobs issues. And I don't know of anyone who has a viable portfolio in their mind that we will be able to do 100 billion as the floor, not the ceiling, going forward. So I think that tracking and holding donors accountable and holding countries accountable to their own climate plans, their NDCs, are the needed thing, and it's the thing that's changing, because the power imbalance between industrializing and industrial nations is still very much there. But the industrializing nations negotiators and business leaders are much more savvy than they were 10 years ago. So I think there's a lot more knowledge of what it takes. The questions being asked about smart grids, about decarbonization, if you go to Kenya, they are just as sophisticated as they are in California. They are just as sophisticated as in Denmark. And so that doesn't solve the financial and the power imbalance, but it says this is a conversation among peers. And so I think that what we do at meetings like Powering Africa, et cetera, is to really keep that dialogue going and come up with bankable projects so that at the annual climate meetings, Glasgow and now Egypt, that we move that along. And to my mind, that's the difference. Whether that difference ends up being enough money and enough commitment, I'm not sure. I think there's a lot of reasons why industrialized nations are and should be skeptical of what industrialized nations are saying. But it's at least a dialogue now, and I would say 10 years ago it wasn't.
Okay. And you're talking about whether or not this money is sufficient. I was at COP26 as well, and I think one of the consensus, unless he didn't make it as an actual commitment, in fact, there was kind of a commitment in the sense that I guess nation was gonna sort of a promise to come to COP27 with a plan. So how
it's the African COP. It's got to be planned. So so on the U.S. government side, I feel like there is a plan. Now, whether it's funded or not, one can be skeptical. But the plan that emerged, highlighted by the special presidential climate envoy John Kerry and by Secretary of Energy Jennifer Granholm, is that we are going to work through the net zero world process. 5 countries, 2 of them in Africa, Nigeria and Egypt, are the African parts of this group of 5. Argentina and Chile in Latin America, and Indonesia, with Ukraine, for obvious reasons, on hold as the 6th. So those 5 countries are the first ones that the U.S. government is partnering with to develop decarbonization plans and to work with the ministries in those countries to come up with a priority list of fundable projects. And more or less the template is what South Africa got, $8.5 billion as this year's funding, but no promise for next year or the year after. And I think that what I was saying before is that what really needs to happen is that needs to become an annual commitment. No one seems to have the money or the interest to do that, but I think that has to be one of the areas of pushback of industrializing countries. How do we get to that level of support? It's actually good for businesses in the North. This is not charity. This is investing in clean energy. Hopefully it will rise up Nigerian and South African and Egyptian and other companies, and it will be good for the donors because they will see the partnerships around investing in the economies whose demand is growing.
Okay, that's great. And because I was going to say, those 100 million from COP26, definitely the consensus was that definitely that's the flow, not the ceiling, for sure. Because we recognize that we actually need more money than that.
Much more money.
In fact,
Right.
I read a report earlier this year from McKinsey that was saying that we need about 9 trillion a year. Yeah, that's what it
In
was
total,
saying.
right.
Yeah, in total. That obviously that's for the whole world.
But if you break it down to country level, so Nigeria and Kenya each did their own internal assessments, and they used companies like McKinsey and Deloitte
Okay.
to do the math. And so I don't think the reports are unique and thoughtfully separate. They're kind of
No.
a little bit tailored for each country. But the Nigerian assessment is that they're going to have to spend over the coming 2 decades something like $1.6 trillion, and they probably need $400 billion beyond what they would have needed just to evolve their energy system to decarbonize it. So take that 400 billion, and let's say we're talking over 20 years, because we'd like to get this done actually. So we're talking about a need that is well over 10 billion a year, but going on for year after year, and nobody has a plan or a realistic path to do that. So you can't, though you walk a mile, you have to start with the first step. 10 billion to each of those net zero world countries. I think that should be the starting demand from the partner countries, and then you build out from there. And you find successful bankable projects, and you build and build. And that, if that happens, then I will feel like these dialogues and these climate conferences and flying around will have done their thing. That doesn't let developing countries off the hook. They still are going to have to finance this at home and insist on domestic manufacturing. We don't want to go from petroleum colonialism to clean energy colonialism, where all the products are being bought from China, US, and the EU. But it's a start of a process to decarbonize. And I think that's where we have to do it, we have to accelerate it.
And that's a very nice transition, because I was going to ask you the question. So what is that developing nation, or at least people from emerging market, should do more? Because I know the conversation, at least from Africa, the conversation is always asking, what can others do for Africa?
Right.
So let's flip that around.
Right. I think you have to flip it. Right. And no matter how much money and how successful a given country is in signing partnerships and getting money out of the North, ultimately, no surprise, these are domestic features. When the eye of world interest shifts, and let's say there's reasonable reason to think that the next global crisis will be around food. We're seeing food instability, we're seeing food production issues, we are a very hungry planet, and if Ukraine and the grain issues all shifts attention to other issues, I hate to say it, but Africa and Southeast Asia, they're going to get forgotten in terms of investing in clean energy, because whatever is most urgent to the rich countries is where they're going to focus their attention. So no one is off the hook, but industrializing nations are going to have to recognize that no matter what level of funding and partnership, handout, whatever you want to call it, they're going to have to do more of it at home. So if I'm president or the minister of energy in an African country, my unemployment rates are high, my fuel costs are high, imported food is going to get more expensive, and what I need to put together is a package of clean energy investments that are attractive to partners in the North, but domestic manufacturing. So if I'm Kenya, I say, look, I really want help building a new geothermal plant or wind farm, but I really want this to be part of an effort to do on-site, in-country, maybe you do assembly, and then manufacturing, and building that capacity. Because ultimately, if you don't do that, you are just as dependent on the North for solar panels and batteries as you were in the fossil fuel world. And that's not a good deal. So that's the hard reality for industrialized nations. And to be honest, that's actually the reality that will produce the most domestic jobs. And so I think it's actually hard medicine, but it's actually good medicine. And so insisting not just on, I don't just need funding concessional money for a PPA for another wind farm. I need that. But I also need to say, how are we going to invest in country manufacturing of the technologies of the future? energy, IT issues, green revolution, so more effective food production, etc. That's where the next partnership, battle, whatever you want to call it, I think has to go.
Two last questions for you. And the first question is, we going towards COP27 in Egypt, Sharm el-Sheikh. So
we're almost there.
We're almost there, definitely. You're absolutely right. So what is your advice? What advice would you give to African nations? I personally don't want to just be the symbolic cup in Africa. We've done with things like that. We don't need that, right? In fact, I don't care where it is as long as...
I mean, it's been in Cape Town.
Exactly.
It's been in Durban. It's been in Morocco twice.
Exactly.
It's going to be in Egypt now. We seem to be picking the ends of the continent. I mean, there was one in Kenya, but a while ago.
So what was... I'm sure you understand what I'm talking about.
No, I do.
I think we don't want to look at this thing, but we've done it already, yeah? So that's it. But going into Egypt, what would you advise African leaders to do to clearly formalize their proposition? And so that obviously it's more, they say, it's more understandable for the North and for the rest of the world to understand this is what Africa wants. This is how we're going to deliver it. How should Africa position itself?
Well, I guess so it's things I've already said to a degree. One is that even if you get the best deal from the North, it still has to be a domestic agenda that even if your donors dry up, you as the president in whatever African country are still committed to. You need help, you need financing to get there, but this has to be a pro-domestic agenda. I understand that gas is going to be part of the equation, and every single head of state and every single utility in Africa says, not only is it not fair for you, the North, to tell me to get rid of gas, but look what you're doing as a response to Ukraine. Germany is restarting coal plants. But I hate to say it, there is a role for gas today of gas you currently have because it's valuable not only for generation needs, but it can effectively be a low-cost battery. In the long term, there is not a role for gas because not only is the funding going to dry up for gas, but spare parts and technical expertise are also going to dry up. And I don't mean it's going to go away. I mean it's going to get more and more expensive to import that. So for me, the agenda is not going to be popular with all countries in Africa, and that is use the gas infrastructure you have, but think about how you're going to use it to enable what comes next. And what I see as the most attractive route is you start to build out renewables, both on-grid and off-grid, although that line is blurring, but you insist on investments in industrial zones. Namibia wants to massively build out solar, but specifically to produce electricity and green hydrogen, and they want to use it domestically and to sell it. Ghana is interested in the same thing. Senegal is really well positioned to have coastal green hydrogen hubs powered by solar and electrolysis. Kenya could do this, and so partnerships with companies and with northern governments around new clean generation capacity and industrial centers, I think is the way to go. The UK is doing it domestically. They're taking their biggest industrial hub in the whole country, Humber. It's going to be all hydrogen. Chile, while not considered a northern country, they are well industrialized. Chile is converting its biggest mining operations to be all run on hydrogen and batteries, and they want to do very large solar plants in the Atacama Desert, some of the best sun in the world. That's the same thing that could happen in Africa. And so getting investments that aren't just in generation capacity, but are also investments in Africa's people. Training centers, industrial hubs, university partnerships that are more applied and more tailored to what industry in Africa needs. Capacity building, it's what Morocco is doing right now to generate a whole new generation of young clean energy engineers, to diversify it, more women, more formerly excluded tribal ethnic groups. Those are ways to build capacity where you can get northern investment, but you're ultimately doing it for yourself.
Excellent response. And actually, the last question, you kind of alluded to a little bit. And that was one of the particularity of this summit, is the Yes Summit, obviously the youth.
Yep.
And I know you've been participating in some of the session, and I know you feel very, very strongly about that. So are you hopeful for the younger generation of Africa?
Well, I'm certainly hopeful because they're incredibly bright and energetic, and they're much more savvy. They're much more savvy than my generation was. I come from a time that was not interdisciplinary, and they are now very interdisciplinary. But as much as we all should want for the youth to have not just a seat at the table in terms of a photo op, but a real legitimate seat, the kind of thing that Greta Thunberg and Vanessa Nkate are arguing for, they ultimately need old people's help in building it. And so how do you make the opportunity for youth leaders to be empowered is something that old people are struggling with. You know, it's easy to have a youth leader on your high-level panel on the stage and then you brush them aside. It's harder to find a way to build those partnerships. So I'm incredibly hopeful because the youth are energetic and they're much more engaged and smarter than I feel like my generation was. But they need a legitimate hand up. Positions in Parliament. In the United States, we had a 26-year-old activist woman from New York City being elected to Congress, Ocasio-Cortez. Africa needs a seat at the table in parliaments, on boards of companies, and African leaders are no more or less ageist than our American leaders, and we don't give up the reins of power very easily, and so finding ways in for youth, companies, universities, public service, that's going to be tricky. And I think that's a place where we have to find ways to sort of build new partnerships. Training programs, entrepreneurial opportunities, policy advisors to heads of state, heads of companies. Those are all ways to build youth capacity and to assist them to displace the old people.
Excellent. Well, that was a wonderful, wonderful interview. Thank you very much for giving up a bit of your time on the last day.
Oh, please, Tony. Anything for you. It's a pleasure to do this.
Thank you for that, and I'm sure our listener will love it. So thank you again, and all the best.
All right.
Have a safe journey back.
And you as well.
Bye.